Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagement here at Varn Blog, and we continue our discussion and development of Lars Lee's first chapter on Lenin Rediscovered What Is to Be Done from the Marxist Unity Group Reader. I believe this is the 5th edition. You can find it online if you so see fit. We've just talked about the German Social Democratic Party self-narrative, and we are getting into that a little more deeply from the present of the German Democratic Party, and by that present actually meaning our past of 1890. Let's get into the text again and get started. For those of you following along, we're on page 19. The social democratic narrative relied heavily on preserving the links between the various key terms. We were talking about worker here and why largely and translate things as worker class and worker party and not working class and labor party. Anyway, take the following crucial sentence from Kautsky's effort program. Why do you selectively translate shit? All right. So bildet sich allmählich auf qualifizieren qualifizierten unqualifizierten Proletarien der Schicht der in Bewegung befindlich Arbeiterklasse der Arbeiterbewegung. So my translation tries to preserve the narrative at thrust. From the skilled and unskilled proletariat, there gradually forms a stratum of the worker class that finds in the movement the worker movement. And that's awkward as fucking English, but I get what he's trying to do. See the end of a Radical Engagement Marxist Unity Group Reader, Section 1, Part 4, for that translation stuff. One final motivation for using worker class in the German Social Democrats is also used the term working class, de Arbeiten in der Klasse. For Engels for Existence uses this in the title of his book that is approximately translated the condition of the working class in England. Often the term working class means everybody in the class except the urban proletariat. And the same passage as the quotation just given, Kautsky talks about the growing influence of the militant proletariat on die anderen Arbeiter in den Klassen. Returning now to the SPD model, we note that the job of the party itself was to ensure that all these institutions work together to carry out the movement's central mission of raising proletarian awareness. Thus, observers were impressed not only by the scope of the SPD agitation, but also by its superb organization. Quote, so efficient is the organization that the socialists boast of being able to flood all Berlin with agitation leaflets in 2 hours. Particularly striking with the extent of what might be called the STD's apparatus, the salary bureaucracy both in the party itself and its offshoots. This is what Robert Michels criticizes the party for, though, and says led to an oligarchical capture. The party apparat was an outward and visible sign of the inward and invisible grace of discipline and organization. So for Lee, this is a good thing. For Michels, this is a corrupting thing. For the SPD model, these were highly positive qualities, as Kautsky put it in a comment cited by Lenin, or Robert Michels. I'm always unclear if I should pronounce it the French way or the German way, since he died in Italy. But anyway. The proletarian is never an isolated individual. He feels great and strong as part of a strong organization. That's not true today, buddy. His individuality counts little beside it. He struggles with full devotion as part of an anonymous mass. Without prospect of personal gain or personal fame, fulfills his duty in his post, which he is placed in voluntary discipline, which he feels his whole feeling and thought. And that sounds like bullshit. I was like, I don't know that I believe that when Kautsky wrote it, and it's definitely not true now. But anyway, Another innovative feature of the SPD model rose out of the manifesto strategy was in fact that it was truly a nationwide party. Indeed, in many ways, it was the only truly nationwide party in the German Empire. The SPD victory attempted to run candidates in as many electoral districts as possible, including many in which it had no chance of victory. And Democrats don't even always do that. Its aim, here as in everywhere, was to spread the word to the masses, even reluctant, unhearing, and scornful masses. The final aspect of the SPD was extremely important for Lenin, can be described using Lenin's own image. It acted as the people's tribune. As the English journalist put in 1912, the German Social Democrats were, quote, the only unterrified tooth-and-nail foes of reaction, insensate militarism, and class rule, the one voice which cries out insistently, fearlessly, implacably against the injustices which, in the opinions of many patriotic men, were retarding the moral progress and sapping the vital resources of the German nation. Thus, the party stood not just for the worker class interest and not just for socialist transformation, but for the principles of democratic decency in society as a whole. Yay! If only such a thing existed in America today, other than the democracy, saving the democracy industrial complex. And by democracy, they really mean technocracy and administrative states, but nonetheless. One central forum for this activity was the parliament. We sometimes tend to equate parliamentary activity with monumental reformism, but at the end of the 19th century, when oratory in general and parliamentary oratory in particular was much more popular and prestigious than today, it's only gotten worse, friend, the SPD's use of parliamentary forum was an essential means of taking its stand and spreading its message. Since later we will hear Lenin talk of Russian Babels, we should remember the basis of Babel's vast influence was his activity as a parliamentary orator whose enormous talent was all the more striking because he personified the entrance to power of the men of toil. No other men of the Reichstag exercised a personal influence equal to his, and one can actually feel a thrill of excitement pass through the whole chamber when he rises to speak. I mean, again, Oswald Spengler describes the same thing about Babel. At a time when parliamentary debates could attract excited crowds, Babel was a figure of European-wide import. Babel's prestige should be kept in mind when we consider Lenin's dream of hegemony, leadership in a revolutionary movement as a whole for Russian social democracy. The existence of the parliament, and especially the right of interpellation, the right of an ordinary member to demand an answer of the cabinet minister on any topic, man, I wish we had that today, allowed small parliamentary minorities to obtain nationwide hearings of their criticisms of the government. As an observer as the American Robert Hunter felt that the right of interpellation as embodied by the Social Democrats in their role as tribune was one of the main bulwarks of political liberty in Europe. Quote, except in Russia and with a few more backwards countries, it is inconceivable that European men should be shot, deported from their homes, and denied every constitutional protection and put at the mercy of martial law, as happened for many months or years ago in Colorado, without the entire country knowing both sides of the case. Again, America, we've never been good at that. Another weapon used by the SPD was its role as the People's Tribune. One central importance to Lenin and Iskra was what Lenin called the political indictments, the exposure of corruption and scandal. You know, yes, socialists should care about the Epstein files. Uncovering abuses, often with the help of sympathetic whistleblowers who passed on incriminating documents, was a major activity of the socialist press. Observers attributed the incredible influence to the embattled party due to the unfriendly and relentless eye it cast on events affecting all classes of society. Besides its heroic past as defier of Bismarck, and besides its energetic president as educated and organizer of the working class and the People's Tribune, the SPD also included the future its narrative of identity. That is, it defined itself as a party inspired by the final goal of social transformation, and as such unique. The inspiration provided by the final goal had two sources. The idea of mission, the calling, the great duty, plus the final outcome was guaranteed by the forces of history. Much commentary on Marxism and social democracy is also fascinated by the supposed contradiction between these two sources. If the outcome is inevitable, why devote your life to ensuring it will come about? Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It's actually a big problem in socialist thinking. See Hal Draper when I talked about this a couple years ago. Such commentary misses the point that in practice, the two sources complemented and strengthened each other. One was polemic. Let's just be honest. It was polemical stance. I don't think until later periods of the Soviet Union that people actually believed that it was absolutely inevitable. I will close with two contemporaneous observers who made this point, so we better understand some of the reasons why would-be founders of the Russian Social Democratic Party thought that theoretical clarity was a life and death matter. Bertrand Russell, writing a book published in 1896, that is prior to the furor caused by Bernstein's revisionism, tells us, quote, "Those who have seen the daily support in the midst of the most wretched conditions, which the more intelligent working men and women derive their fervor and religious belief in the ardent advent of the socialist state, and from their convictions that historical development is controlled by irresistible forces in the hands of men that are only puppets, and by whose actions diminution and final extinction of the capitalist class is inevitably the decree of fate, those who have seen the strength, compactness, and fervor which this religion gives to those who hold it, will hardly regard its decay as likely to help the progress of the party." Man, this is some hyper voluntarist stuff here. Russell was a sympathetic outsider, only kind of sympathetic. The Austrian Social Democratic leader Victor Adler may be considered an insider. Writing at the Stuttgart Congress of 1898, that is, the German party had similarly officially repudiated Bernstein's position before his famous book Presumptions of Socialism had appeared, Adler exclaimed, this is a long quote, "How impractical these practical people so often are. The strength of our party, the efficiency of every single one of our comrades depends on his knowledge that the extraordinary amount of labor, sacrifice, courage, and endurance which he must daily exact from himself and from others is not just devoted to the welfare of the individual groups around him, but he is a vehicle for a better history, that he is working not only for the present, but also for the future." We will begin the section Kautsky and his class leadership. In support of his argument and what is to be done, Lenin quoted rather long passages by Karl Kautsky. Much ink has been spilled on the relationship between Lenin's views and Kautsky's views as present in this passage, but most of the discussion is beside the point, since Lenin's real debt to Kautsky is much earlier and much more basic. One might say that Kautsky's influence is hidden in plain view, since the crucial text is the final chapter of Kautsky's Erfurt program, probably the most fundamental statement of what social democracy is all about. Kautsky is remembered as the most influential theoretician of international social democracy, but in certain key respects, particularly in the case of the fledgling Russian social democracy, Kautsky's role went far beyond influence. In 1892, Kautsky wrote the Erfurt program, a semi-official commentary on the recently adopted program of the Social Democratic Party of Germany. This book defined social democracy for Russian activists. It was the book one read to find out what it meant to be a social democrat. In 1894, a young provincial revolutionary named Vladimir Ulyanov translated the Erfurt program into Russian just at the time he was acquiring his lifelong identity as a revolutionary social democrat. Despite the canonical status of the Erfurt program for Lenin's generation, it is ignored today, at least by English-speaking scholars, yet because later declarations against Kautsky by Lenin and Kautsky's own writings in the 1920s. Few are even aware that the existing English translation, first issued in 1912, is a bouldernizing abridgment that serves only to obscure what someone like Lenin might have taken out of the book. Besides, the Erfurt program, the principal text of my reconstruction of Kautsky's outlook as parliamentarianism, 1893, cited directly by Lenin and what is to be done as an authority for some of his key arguments. This book really has been totally forgotten. The copy I read was one of the hardest to obtain and most discrepant of the texts I consulted for this commentary. Parliamentarianism is unjustly forgotten since it is one of the few works in the Marxist tradition dealing exactly with political theory and, in my views, compares favorably with Lenin's State and Revolution. Largely, and McNairist in general tend to be uncomfortable with State and Revolution. And since I mentioned State and Revolution, let me say that it should not be anachronistically see Kautsky as defending parliamentary democracy as opposed to, say, Soviet democracy. What Kautsky means by parliamentarianism in 1890 is essentially representative democracy. As such, it cannot really be opposed to Soviet-style democracy, itself a form of representative democracy. For our purposes, parliamentarianism is important not only because of the arguments that Lenin uses explicitly, but also because the book brings together, better than anywhere else, the logic behind what the Russians labeled the strategy of parliamentary hegemony and democratic revolution. I occasionally use revealing passages from other works by Kautsky, including one or two that were written after the publication of What Is to Be Done, but since both the Erfurt program and parliamentarianism are in different ways forgotten works, and since their influence on Lenin is indisputable, I rely mainly on them for my exposition. Okay, well, we know we have selection here, but we know why. Circles of awareness. Kotsky conceived of social democracy as the inner ring of a concentric circles. Yeah, we see this come up a lot by Lenin's. In a key passage in the Erfurt program describe these circles and their mutual relationships. Terms usually translated as consciousness, bewusst, here translated as aware. From skilled and unskilled proletarian that gradually forms a stratum of worker class that finds itself in the movement, the worker movement, that is a part of the proletariat that fights for the common interests of its class, the ecclesiastics and militants, the fighting church. The stratum glows at the expense of the arrogant worker aristocrats stuck in their egoism as well as their dull rabble, the lower stratum of the wage proletariat that vegetates in hopelessness and powerlessness. We can already see looking for the perfect proletariat is something that German social democracy was always trying to do. That's a problem. We'll come back to why it's a problem, but in Notes History of Separation, I think they say a lot of stuff that's false, but one of the things they're right about is this idealized worker, which the workers' movement took as an ideal type, and how much of a problem that is for the workers' movement often. Anyway, we'll come back to that. We have seen the worker proletariat is constantly increasing. We know further that it is becoming ever more decisive for the other working classes, whose living conditions and whose way of feeling and thinking is ever more influenced by it. Now we see that in the ever-growing mass, the fighting section grows not only absolutely, but proportionately. No matter how fast the proletariat grows, the fighting section grows even faster. If only that was true after World War II. But sadly, it is not. The fighting proletariat is by far the most important and productive recruiting ground for social democracy. Social democracy is nothing other than the fighting part of the proletariat that is aware of its goal. In turn, the fighting proletariat has a tendency to become more and more synonymous with social democracy. In Germany and Austria, the two have actually, in actuality, become one. Using this passage, I've created a diagram called Kotsky's Circle of Awareness. See Figure 1.1. I actually find it funny because some Leninists have come to this on their own. The remainder of this discussion on Kotsky will be devoted to teasing out the implications hidden in the chart. The first point, and a very important one for understanding what is to be done, the term worker movement used in the merger formula is a technical one with a fairly precise meaning within the social democratic discourse. The worker movement is neither the proletariat as a whole, nor is it social democracy. It is a militant or fighting proletariat, the section of the proletariat animated by the spirit of organized resistance. Social democracy in the center. Next concentric circles worker movement. Next concentric circles proletariat. Next concentric circles the laboring classes. Largely's description of the Kotsky circle awareness. At one point in time, members of the outside circles will always have less awareness. That is, less insight into their own class position, basic interests, and therefore historic mission. I do like that Lee is translating this as awareness and not consciousness, because consciousness has a whole different problem in the way Marxists use it in English. Yet viewed over time, this tendency for the movement enter more aware circles to expand. Social democracy becomes a greater and greater portion of the worker movement, while the worker movement becomes a greater and greater portion of the whole proletariat. And at this limit, all circles collapse into one circle of complete awareness. Thus, a revolutionary subject is born or something. You know, this feels very Lukashian too, actually. What we still do not know is the nature of the forces that are working to bring the circle together. Kotsky's brief description of the process might leave the impression that the whole thing is automatic. This impression is strengthened by the frequent occurrence of Kotsky's favorite word. Natural not vindicate. Natural necessity. Okay, I'm just going to use it in English. It's easier to say. We therefore need to ask, what are the amalgamating forces in Kotsky's model, and in which direction do they operate? Does the worker movement give rise to a highly aware inner circle that forces through forces internal to itself, or does social democracy move out to transform the worker movement in its own image? The answer is somewhat complicated by the fact Kotsky has two aims in this section of the Erfurt program. One is to provide the ideal model of the past and future of social democracy, its origins and its destiny. The other is to set out an explicitly counterfactual and highly unlikely scenario, and other than make the theoretical point about natural necessity of socialism. We'll first examine Kotsky's thought experiment, which is all the more important to us because it is cited at length in disputes with Russian social democracy about the orthodoxy of what is to be done. For example, Plekhanov in his 1904 article attacking what is to be done cites this. issue. Okay, just bringing that up. One time where it was necessary, and not just a citation. For various rhetorical and theoretical purposes, Koski wants to show that socialism is an inevitable, natural necessity, even if there was no social democracy. Oh boy. In fact, even if the workers did not accept socialist ideas. Yeah, this is the part that gets often criticized by people as the overly staged form of the Second International that just like kind of sat on its laurels because it thought things were inevitable. He therefore invites us to consider the outcome, even if social democracy was absent from the picture. The chain of inferences proceeds as follows. 1. It is inevitable that workers will resist capitalist exploitation. That is, it is inevitable that there be a workers' movement. 2. It is inevitable that this resistance lead to a nationwide worker political party. Well, that happened in the United States, buddy. 3. It is inevitable that this party will take the control of the state. That didn't happen in Germany for very long, buddy. 4. It is inevitable that the workers will use this power to introduce socialism because, as they will discover as much after trial and error, socialism is the only way to protect their essential interests. Man, the number of assumptions this argument makes. Okay, but anyway. Thus, and only at the very last minute, just as certain as the curtain goes down, the workers discover and accept the merits of socialism. And B, this last minute conversion also can be called social democracy. The point of this thought experiment is to show that even in the worst case scenario, socialism is still inevitable. I don't think Marx actually believed that. Marx's common ruin of the contending classes was a real possibility. Nevertheless, Kotsky immediately adds, this is indeed a worst case scenario because socialism arrives only after a great many misconceptions, errors, and unnecessary sacrifices and leashes expenditure of strength and time. I call this a sooner or later argument. I call it unconvincing. Personally, I'm just very serious about this. This part of Kotskyism has never convinced me at all. It turns up rather frequently in social democratic writing as a way of combining the core social democratic claim of inevitability with the core social democratic urgency about proselytizing the workers, aka what seems like a contradiction is not a contradiction because I say so. As young Stalin put it when he recycled Kotsky's argument in 1905 in order to defend the orthodoxy of what is to be done, quote, of course, at some point after long wanderings and sufferings, the Stinhinyi elemental movement, even without the help of social democracy, will come into its own and arrive at the gates of socialist revolution. Well, I mean, maybe, but how long is your time frame? Having made his worst case scenario, Kotsky returns from his thought experiment to the real world. He hastens to assure us that the chances that events will play out in a manner are vanishingly small. Yeah, except that we live in a world where the vanishingly small apparently happened. And not only happened, but happened multiple times. The following extensive but crucial passage explains the forces that are actually at work to expand the circles of awareness. Nevertheless, there is absolutely no reason to expect that the proletariat of any country will adopt such a negative attitude towards socialism after it comes to power. Yeah, after it comes to power being a problem. This means in relation to awareness and the knowledge, it remains the level of a child, while economically, politically, and morally it becomes an adult, one with the power and capability of overcoming a powerful opponent and imposing its will. Such misshapen development of the proletariat is highly unlikely. We've already noted that more than once, thanks to the mechanized society, there is in the proletariat and the original degradation that it has overcome a theoretical sense of capacity for the great problems and goals that lie outside the realm of immediate interest, one that searches in vain for other working and liberal classes under it and over it. At the same time, furthermore, the economic development of the present-day society proceeds so rapidly and manifests itself in such mass conspicuous phenomena that it's recognized even by an uneducated person once his attention is called to it. There won't be any lack of attention calling, since simultaneously, thanks to the continuation of Karl Marx of the work begun by the bourgeois classical economy, insight into the course of economic development and the whole economic mechanism becomes exceptionally deep and comprehensive. This is all Kotsky, by the way. This all comes to make the fighting proletariat extremely receptive to socialist teaching. Socialism is no message of woe for the proletariat, but rather of good news, a new gospel, ein neues evangelium. The new ruling class cannot recognize socialism without committing moral suicide. The proletariat finds in socialism new life, new power, new inspiration, and joy of hope. Will the proletariat remain indifferent or even hostile to such a teaching for any length of time? Did it, though? I mean, this is hard for me to just take as rhetoric because we have to actually look at the rest of the 20th century and not just go back to the end of the 19th and early 20th, where all this didn't have a history that makes this difficult to deal with. I mean, there are many ways in which socialists today just want to bypass all this stuff. I mean, whether or not they want to make the Sino-Soviet split disappear, or the failure of the German Revolution disappear, or the ugly parts of the USSR disappear, because it makes them look bad. Except that this assumes socialism is so weak that reality could not be breaking it, or that you're so naive as to think that there's no reality to many of the problems that were formed at hand. Anyway. Once an independent worker party has been formed, it will necessarily sooner or later adopt a socialist outlook if it's not been filled with an outlook from the very beginning, and finally it must become a socialist worker party that is social democracy. We now see the chief recruiting ground of social democracy clearly before us. In brief, the conclusion of our discussion is as follows. The bearer of the socialist movement is the fighting strata of the industrial proletariat that has attained political self-awareness. The more influence this proletariat has on the social strata near it to it grows, the more the thinking and emotions of the strata are influenced, all the more they will be drawn into the socialist movement. The class struggle of the proletariat has socialist production as its natural goal. It cannot end before its goal is reached, just as the proletariat will certainly come to be the ruling class in the state, so equally the victory of socialism. So equally is the victory of socialism certain. You can see why the 20th century is such a scandal to this. We now describe more concretely the forces at work in Kautsky's model. First, there is a force that comes about automatically within the workers' movement, the spirit of resistance. As we have seen, resistance is capable of eventually getting us to socialism all by itself, and this point is almost irrelevant in real life. What is more important is that the spirit of resistance, along with other features of the industrial proletariat, makes the worker movement receptive to the good news brought by social democracy. Since social democracy and its message do exist, we have the new natural necessity. Any workers' party will sooner or later adopt a socialist program. Not true. They mostly drop them. This natural necessity does not detract from the fact that in real life, social democracy is the active force that transformed the worker movement by expanding awareness. Social democracy relies on the militant proletariat as an ideal recruiting ground, and so directs its efforts there. Social democracy definitely does not emanate automatically from the worker movement in order to serve the movement's own ends more effectively. Rather, it is a force particular insight that comes originally from Marx and Engels. What happens to the ruin of the contending classes part of this? This seems to be just bracketed out, even in Lee's recount. Now we see the relevant meaning of confidence in the social democratic context. In terms of the worst case scenario, which is a thought experiment, there are far worse case scenarios. The far worst case scenario of Marx was the death of the contending classes. That is not the worst case scenario because Kautsky can allow himself to imagine it. Kautsky also imagines that labor will always be socialized by bigger and bigger capital, except we know that's not fucking true. The social democrat is confident that the worker will eventually introduce socialism. In real life scenario, the social democratic is confident that the worker movement will hear, mark, and in religious jest the social democratic method as soon as it is in position to receive it. Even the unlearned, the Ungelhörter, will achieve this insight. But they don't, though. I mean, like, this is such a hypothetical argument that the fact that it's repeated as something obvious is kind of crazy to me, particularly at the end of the 20th century. But we'll see what Lars Lee does with it. Since this new natural necessity, a worker party will sooner or later adopt a socialist program. It's dependent on insight. The actual timing is not closely tied to the course of capitalist development. Yeah, that's an argument against Bernstein. The most advanced social democracy need not be found in the most advanced capitalist country. Aha, take that, certain other people in the socialist movement that really annoy me. It can conceivably be found, say, in Germany rather than England, or in China rather than Germany, or wherever. Indeed, as says Kautsky at some point, that even the workers in the economically backwards Russia are more politically advanced in their thinking than the English workers. See, this seems like post hoc logic, though, because it doesn't flow from the theoretical insights given before that the most advanced would necessarily drive later. Just means that because social democracy is an actor, you could have advancements earlier on. The driving force in this respect is equality of leadership rather than the level of productive forces. Well, sure. Although that makes a hash out of Soviet thinking later on. Yeah, we're getting to the problems that all these things run into. Thus, we see the circles of awareness are constantly shifting in relation to one another. The basic formula defines social democracy as a merger of socialism and the worker movement. But only context can inform us when social democratic writers use the term worker movement, whether they mean worker movement prior to social democracy, defined by its militant resistance or loaned, or transformed by social democratic insight and organization. Much in misunderstanding about orthodoxy of this or that formulation is caused by resulting ambiguities. You think? Also, there's a lot of just assumptions in all this. The best way to avoid such misunderstanding is to keep in mind the underlying narrative. Yeah, but if the underlying narrative is not true, you're just proposing a Sorelian mythic narrative. And anyway, just kind of anti-Marxist, but nonetheless, I guess that's where we're at. On one side, we have a worker movement animated by the spirit of resistance, and on the other, we have a social democracy animated by the insight that merger is necessary. Note that when an individual worker becomes convinced of the truth of scientific socialism, he, by the virtue of the very fact, is a part of social democracy rather than simply the worker movement, thus making it a matter of definition to assert the awareness comes from social democracy. The inner forces of the two protagonists drive them into each other's direction and eventually lead to their melding, which sounds dialectical, and I can accept that. It's just there's so many assumptions of automaticity here that this stuff would just happen on their own because resistance necessarily leads to this, and this necessarily leads to this, except we have a history where it didn't. Since you're making an argument about historical inevitability, treating it as an abstract argument seems, frankly, a little bit historically dishonest. We may sum up the moral circles of awareness in the following way. Social democracy is needed and will be heeded. Except it was and it wasn't. It is not needed to achieve socialism since this will come about regardless. So far it hasn't, and except that maybe how you feel about AAS countries, and even they don't claim to have fully achieved socialism. It is needed to avoid human tragedy because it would be called socialism rather than sooner. It is heeded because it is good news. It brings about the proletariat new life, new power, and inspiration, and joy of hope. So much for materialism in that, I suppose. I'm going to be honest with you. If we base our arguments around this as inevitable, these arguments are actually fairly weak. The actual lived history of the socialist movement begins in this, but does not end there. And maybe it'll come back, but it comes back under different conditions, and we have to acknowledge that. We're going to stop right here. Protect your peace.